Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of The Study, and we are in the NCERT concept series. Today we are going to study the chapter 6 of class 7's history NCERT. So let's begin. See, let's first go over the contents of the book. If you recall, we have been through first 5 chapters. In the first chapters, we have talked about the sources and the major trends of changes that we will continuously witness throughout the medieval period. Then we talked about two important events of early medieval period, the tripartite struggle, the struggle for Kannauj between three major empires, and then at the same times and slightly later, the rise of Chola Empire deep south and the process of urbanization, their extent of centralization, their economic activities and the levels of Panchayati Raj institutions, etc. Then we talked about Delhi Sultanate and Mughal Empire. Mughal Empire came after Delhi Sultanate. We looked into the series of sultans and series of badshahs, their important political events, their conquests, their internal consolidation, their external expansion, all right, and their decline as well, and some other major economic and social trends during that period. Then in the fifth chapter, we looked into the message that the kings, the badshahs, the sultans wanted to deliver via their buildings. We talked about two sorts of buildings. First, were for private consumption, forts, gardens, palaces, and another for public view or public usage, for the mosque, temple, tanks, etc. Now, today we are going to focus on the sixth chapter, towns, traders, and craft persons. Essentially, what we are talking about is urbanization. Okay, because all these processes are linked to urbanization and social changes related to urbanization. Okay, so let's continue. In this chapter, we will first see that there are different sorts of towns and we will give some examples. For example, administrative centers, temple towns and pilgrim centers, and often they combined these functions and created composite towns. And then not only big towns, but even a network of small towns between villages. So at the extreme end, you will have small villages, then larger villages, then you will have a network of towns, then you will have big cities, capitals and pilgrim centers, etc. Then in these cities, you have obviously big and small traders and other craft activities in these cities. Eventually, we will take a close look at three cities, Hampi, Masulipatam and Surat. Now this is on east coast, okay. This is on west coast, and Hampi, the capital of Vijayanagar. And then at last we will see urbanization driven by European companies. If you recall, in the chapter on Mughal Empire, we had talked about 17th century trade revolution, isn't it? So that trade revolution certainly had an impact on urbanization as well. A new sort of towns called presidency towns emerged, and we will look into them. Although much of the story is continued during 18th century, which will be modern era, therefore a large part of this segment will be covered in next classes NCERT. But first of all, what is a town? Okay. Now, while we are studying these things, do not ponder over the modern usage like metropolitan city and such things. Okay. Right now, we are only talking about towns. Okay. Now, in modern sense, a town means a very small urban locality. But here, the meaning of town is simple, a city. So, what is a town? A simple definition will be where a majority of population is involved in non-agrarian activity. Okay, this is a simple definition, that where a majority of population should be involved in non-agrarian activity and their entire subsistence need of food and other stuff will be met by trade with hinterland, with villages near and far. Okay. So a majority of population is involved in non-agricultural activity, and their requirement for food and foodstuff is met via trade. So this will be a very simple definition. Now, rise of urban centers or urbanization is closely linked with agrarian productivity and surplus extraction. If you recall, we had talked about now due to some technological changes or some other factor, say climate change, especially during, or a new source of a new technological changes like iron technology, like paddy transplantation, like new irrigation methods, like Persian wheel, or state sponsored in large investment in irrigation, just as we had seen in the case of cholas and stuff. So any sort of change or expansion of agrarian lifestyle into more fertile areas. So any sort of change that brings agrarian surplus has some following impacts. A, state can directly tax it, okay, and it helps. Then it can create a larger and stronger state. Then it allows proliferation of crafts. Why? Because if there is enough surplus, then a part of labor force can completely switch over from agriculture and focus on specializing in certain art and craft. Earlier, they would have to perform crafts for certain period or at least for certain months in a year, and for then certain months they will have to go for agriculture, because if there is not enough surplus. But if there is enough surplus and their needs of food stuff etc can be met via trade, then it will certainly lead to proliferation of crafts. And here surplus can lead to urbanization as well. Why? Because an urban center's need will be met by a trade with villages, craft persons will live in cities, and even the state that has collected tax, it will create capital, religious centers, trading centers etc. This will also contribute to urbanization. And in fact all these processes are interlinked, none of them are one-way process. Okay, all of them are actually two-way processes. Because if you recall, even state not only taxes agricultural surplus, it taxes craft activities and urban activities as well. So this is the schematic. A close relationship with agrarian productivity and surplus extraction. Okay, urbanization has a close relationship. Both first and second urbanization. The first one was in Indus Valley, if you recall, or Harappan civilization. The second one was in Ganga Valley, the Mahajanpad period. Similarly, the urbanization in Deep South, which is currently believed to have started in post-Mauryan period, though certain historians and certain archaeological evidences tell us that it may have started as early as Mahajanpad period. Though that is not a concluded argument. That debate is still open. Some say that once the urbanization in South India started in post-Mauryan period or maybe before, then it has continuously went on right up till Mughal times. There has been no break as in the case of North India. Here, either it is first, second urbanization in Deep South or in medieval period from 11th century. If you recall, then we had said that there are some historians who argue that at the end of Gupta period, there was a certain decline in urbanization, especially in the North India. And they say that this decline was halted sometime around 10th or 11th century. But then some other historians say that no, there was no such decline. Though certain urban centers declined, some new came up. Okay, and that we will see in when we look into the networks of small towns. So there is this argument. Some say that yes, there was a temporary pause or decline. Some say no, there wasn't any. In any case, we do know that by the time Delhi Sultanate was established, the urbanization process received another boost. and during the Mughal period it was accelerated. Okay, so even if we discount the argument of on whether there was any deacceleration in post Gupta period, in early medieval period, we certainly know that at least from Delhi Sultanate period the process was accelerated, and it became really rapid from the Mughal period. A new push in medieval period and accelerated during the Mughal period. And there are actually many sorts of towns: a temple town or a religious town, an administrative center, a garrison. If you recall, we talked about the garrison towns, that how Delhi Sultans could only control garrison towns during the first part of 13th century. It is only later that they started internal and external consolidation. So a garrison is where a fortified city or a citadel where soldiers are stationed. Now soldiers have certain needs. They need certain goods and services. Those they will get from trade. So gradually a garrison town becomes a proper town where people, non-soldiers also live. A commercial town or a port town. These are a variety of towns, and many towns eventually combined several functions. For example, Thanjavur, we will see the example of Thanjavur later. Okay, where what happened, that the Chola kings had their capital in Thanjavur, and at Thanjavur they built many lavish temples as well. Then say a place like Shirdi, which was essentially a religious place, a town developed around it. So these are some of the points that I wanted to emphasize on the issue of what is a town. Okay. An administrative center could be a capital of a state or a provincial headquarter. Say if there is an Iqtadar, and the headquarter of Iqtadar will also gradually develop into town. Temple towns were not only places of worship, they were the hub of economic, social and cultural life as well. If you recall, when we were discussing the Chola Empire and we talked about how the temples that were given more and more land grants eventually became center of a social cultural life, because they were giving stimulus to so many other activities that were associated with religion: pilgrimage, tourism, certain sorts of crafts, certain sort of art, etc. That eventually a town or becomes, a temple town becomes a proper town. And you can see examples of that in modern times as well. If you go to a certain city which is famous for its temple, imagine if you take that temple out of the city, what would be left? If it has no manufacturing, if it is not a capital, if it is not a port, so the entire range of urban activity is dependent or circles around that particular temple itself. So there are a variety of towns, and sometimes towns combine more than one function as well. Okay. Now in this chapter they have only this map. I have taken this map from the chapter on Delhi Sultanate. These are some of the towns. Here they have highlighted the political centers or garrisons which Delhi Sultanate conquered in the initial period. Look, there are so many cities, and here which they mainly focus on south, though some of the areas like Ganga Valley they have skipped, or the greater Bengal area they have skipped, or this area they have skipped. But see, there are so many craft centers here. Okay, say Mahabalipuram, a temple town; Tirupati, a temple town. Now, a temple town will certainly emerge as a craft center sooner or later. For example, we had talked about the Chola bronze images, that the Chola temples have large number of bronze images made in the lost wax technique. So, to make such fine quality bronze images, you need artists, right, to make such fine quality stone sculptures. Okay, I mean, the architect of Thanjavur temple Brihdeshwara temple is such that they had to build a 4 kilometer long incline so that the large 90-ton Kalash could be transported to the top of Viman. So such activities eventually convert a single purpose city or a town into a multi-purpose city or town. And then you have Kanchipuram, till today famous for textile and many temples as well. Madurai, capitals of Pandyas and many important temples. Somnath, it was, at least in medieval time, it was famous for trade as well. Okay, and the same was temple. Surat by the Mughal time had become very important. Okay, and then Pushkar, Ajmer. Now see, Ajmer was earlier the capital of Chauhans. Then it became important under Delhi Sultanate, and then it became a very important Sufi center. So similarly Pushkar. So there are many such examples. Okay, that up to the beginning of this period, up to the beginning of medieval period, you can, whether there was a break, whether there was a decline or not, up to the medieval period, especially from the onset of Delhi Sultanate, the urbanization had again picked up. It was growing at a robust pace, and that pace further accelerated during the Mughal period. That is the message I want you to carry. And they are giving so many towns. Most of them are, for example, Iltutmish was the Iqtadar of Badaयूं. Okay, here Allahabad area, here somewhere there will be Allahabad, a place called Kara. Alauddin Khalji was the Iqtadar of Kara. So there are many such places. There, if you recall, we had talked about the Balban's strategy against Mongols. What he had done, he had created two line defenses. First line ran across Lahore, Multan, and there was this place near here, Dipalpur. This was the first line of defense against the Mongols. This was the first line. And then here he created another line where he had three cities. So they were very close to each other. One of them, Sunam, is given here. Another was Samana, and there was then Bhatinda. So many such activities encouraged urbanization in this period. Kings constructed temples in their capitals and sometimes built their capital around ancient temples. For example, for this part, I will give you the example of Thanjavur. Okay, but here I will say sometimes they build their capitals around ancient temples. For this part, I will give you the example of Hampi. I mean, it is widely believed that the Vijayanagar capital Hampi was built at that particular location because it was already associated with the Virupaksha temple and Pampa Devi. So they thought that since this will be the guardian deity of our state, therefore we will construct a capital around this place. Temple authorities use their wealth to finance trade and banking. Obviously, if you have so much surplus capital, so even today, if temples are, since even modern temples have so much wealth from donations, not now state doesn't give them land grant, but still common people, middle class and rich people make them lot of donations. So what do? They buy government securities, they invest. Okay, they invest in, sometimes they park their funds in banks, which is safest. Sometimes they invest in, certain instruments. Sometimes they invest in government securities, what we call GSEC. So this is very common sense activity, that if you have so much land and so much surplus is being generated, even after making, paying for all the expenditure needs of the temple, if you have surplus, then you should invest in trade and activity. Okay, therefore this is how the economy works. And there are examples: Thanjavur, Madurai, Ajmer, Billaswamy, Bhilsa or Vidisha. Now see, this Vidisha area is so important since ancient time. Sanchi is close. Then there was this Besnagar pillar inscription of Heliodorus of post-Mauryan period. Okay, then it was important in medieval period as well. Somnath, it was important for trade as well as temple activity. Many of the merchants lived in the area. And in fact, if you go to Somnath today, it's a rather small city apart from the temple. But in pre-modern period, it is very unlikely that a standalone temple will exist around a very small city. Certainly, either it would be a capital. Certainly, either it may also have a large trading class that invests or receive in trade. So in at least medieval period, it was a port and a lot of trading activity was going on. Therefore, even after repeated attacks on Somnath, it could rebuild itself. Kanchipuram, Vrindavan, Tiruvannamalai, and these are some of the examples where such composite activities were going on. Even Sufi saints started pouring in India and set up their own silsilas. So some of the Sufi saints came immediately after the establishment of Delhi Sultanate. Okay, then some Sufi saints and a very large number of a very large quantity of intellectual class of Central and West Asia, including Sufi saints, came to India in the aftermath of Mongol onslaught. Because such was the destruction that Mongols were causing in that part of the world, that they had no choice but to flee, and the obvious choice was the refuge of Delhi Sultanate and the cities of North India. Then there was another problem in 1398 when Timur attacked. So when his attacks, there was a proper threat, genuine threat of his imminent attack. A lot of people moved out of Delhi and went towards Deccan, central India. Okay, what you call Banda Nawaz Jesudharaj, a very prominent saint, Sufi saint. He moved out of Delhi during that point. Then when Muhammad bin Tughlaq had shifted his capital from Delhi to Tughlaqabad, this was also an event which triggered a migration of Sufi saints from north to Deccan. Okay, so there were many such activities, and almost always their khankas where they lived, they will turn into around them you will gradually a city will develop. Okay, often the headquarters of iqtadars, you must recall the iqta system of Delhi Sultanate, it gradually develops into a town. The garrison towns, Firoz Shah Tughlaq built many cities, Hisar Firoza, Jaunpur, such, Firoz Shah Kotla, such many of the cities were built by him. Okay, in fact, he made large scale investment in agriculture. Especially, it is believed that due to his investment in especially canal irrigation, that surplus helped in rise of these new cities. Ports are around since ancient times and new ones developed as well. Okay, and an example from ancient time we can give that even Buddhist stupas and monasteries were on important trade routes and near cities. If you recall, the trade routes were in Junnar caves or Sanchi, in Amravati. So this is not something new. The relationship between religion and the patronage to religion, it obviously you will patronize religion one if you have some wealth. Okay, if you have some disposable income which you will spend on your piety and donation. So the relationship between religion, saintly figures, trading class, ruling class, this is not new. This is an ancient phenomena. Okay, that is why I have given this example here. Apart from these big cities, you had a network of small towns. See, if you recall, I had said that there was this debate among historians that whether there was a decline or a deacceleration in urbanization in the post-Gupta period. Okay, one group says certainly, another says no, and even if some towns declined, because there are some travelers like Huyen Sang who came to India during the period of Harsha, and some later travelers, they have said that certain cities that were important previously had declined by then. So they say that look, this might be true that yes, certain cities declined, but that may have happened because of some other considerations, and if some cities declined, then new cities came up. Okay, this is along those lines. They say that trade at the local level certainly flourished because remember, agriculture continued expanding due to the phenomena of land grants. Agriculture continued expanding during this period. So they say there is no reason for the decline of cities. So they are saying that look, land grants were being given and they were being given more and more. So agriculture will expand. Though because of land grants, there will be some degree of feudalization, but the agricultural surplus will ensure that trade at the local level and certainly at a trans-regional level will continue as well. From 8th century onwards, this is key, they say no decline in urbanization. Subcontinent was dotted with several small towns. These probably emerged from large villages or temporary markets, gradually turned into permanent market towns. So earlier they were maybe temporary, that people from nearby villages will come together, exchange their goods, okay, and then go back, come at maybe they come, in modern times, especially on India Bangladesh border and India Myanmar border, we have these border hearts. where you have a certain fixed date that once in 2 weeks or maybe at some other interval, what happens that the local people that live near the international boundary, they come there and they exchange their goods. Okay. Now sometimes trade happens in kind, sometimes trade happens in cash. This was, so those are temporary markets. Even here they are saying that maybe some of the early temporary markets gradually turned into permanent markets. And they are given some names that at the lowest level you would have hatta, which we call now hart. Okay. You know the word bazar hart, which is common in Hindi. Mandapika, which is called mandi. Now they have, in the book, they have given only two examples, this one and this one. But historians often argue that these markets were at the lowest end of the chain. Then these were intermediary markets. The Mandapika, Pentha, Deccan, in Deccan they call Pentha, in South they call Nagaram, and these were large cities, especially coastal ports, Pattan. Okay. So they say this was the chain of markets. At the lowest level, much closer to the villages, at the intermediate level, and then you have these emporiums and cities. Then also Kasbah. Now the word, you must know the word Kasbah in these days because it means small settlements. But originally there were many outposts of a state. Say a small body of soldiers will live somewhere, or a Sufi saint which is not that famous, but he will live around with his disciple and practice agriculture. Get local following. So such local places developed into small towns as well. Also, many of the sultans and badshah, especially Muhammad bin Tughlaq or Sher Shah Suri, they ensured that along long trade routes, traders and caravan merchants had places to rest, and so that they could rest there, get some food, get their animals something to eat. They can rest overnight. So they built many sarais. Even in Delhi, you have so many places which have sarai at the end. Okay, in South Delhi near JNU, you have this Katpadia Sarai, Jia Sarai. There are many such places, and not only in Delhi, across the country, you have these small places with name called Sarai after them. Okay, so such places gradually turned into towns, and obviously they will trade with areas nearby. Say if there is a sarai where they have constant need of foodstuff or animal feed, water, such thing, how would they fetch it? They will trade with the nearby areas. So this is how urban centers, or what they say, that they were dotted with several urban centers. This is how smaller urban centers emerged. Usually a samant or a zamindar built a small fort in or near these towns. They levied taxes on traders and artisans, and sometimes donated the right to collect these taxes to local temples which had been built by these some zamindars themselves or by the rich merchants. These rights were recorded in inscriptions. That is how we know that once a temporary town turned into a permanent town. Now that must be located on a land which may belong to someone. It may belong to a local zamindar, it may belong to a local iktadar, it may belong to a local mansabdar. So what they would want to do, they would want to collect taxes from there. Okay, they will set up some administration, or if they are feeling particularly pious, particularly religious, then they will build a temple and they will allocate the right to collect taxes from that nearby market which is developing into cities to the temples. And how do we know? What are our sources? The inscriptions where they have said that look, temple authorities can collect these taxes from these kind of traders, shopkeepers and farmers, etc. Now some of those taxes will be collected in kind. Say a temple has a lot of use of oil. Okay, so what they would say, that from oil millers you can collect tax in kind. But if there is a salt merchant, a temple doesn't have much use of salt, so they will say you collect tax in cash. Say a sweet maker, you can collect in kind because you need a lot of it. But if there is a rope maker, collect in cash. So that will vary from place to place. Idea is simple. The growth of urban centers, the expansion of craft activities, and expansion of religious activities, they are all woven together. Okay, some of these taxes were collected in kind, some in cash, which we have given here. Now we're talking about traders. There were obviously a variety of traders, the small ones and the big ones, and you will have intermediate ones as well. Obviously, if there are intermediate towns, then why would you not have intermediate traders? Banjara, nomads. Now, in about Banjaras, you will read in more detail in next chapter. In next chapter, they have given examples like how Alauddin Khilji used Banjaras to transport grain to his cities, how they were supplying Mughal armies which were on the march with foodstuff and their regular provisions. How Banjaras used to transfer horses from as far away Central Asia and Afghanistan to India. So basically, they moved from places to places. They would purchase. If you recall, in ancient India, we had talked about a particular Sangam poem, which tells us that a particular a bunch of traders came to a coastal city, picked up salt in exchange for grain, and then went away. So such moving people that also take part in trade is actually very common. It is only with the onset of modernization that especially the modernization under colonial leadership, that the moving way of life, the mobile way of life was considered rather threat to the order and state. They said, look, everybody should settle over a land, practice a particular economic activity, pay regular taxes, don't disturb law and order. So this idea that a mobile way of life is rather in any way inferior to settled way of life, it is essentially a colonial conception. In pre-colonial society, there were people that lived a settled life, there were people that lived a mobile life, and there were people who were partly settled and partly mobile. Banjaras, horse traders, pastoral tribes, what they will do, they will rear animals, okay, and then sell it, animals like sheep, etc., and they will sell it to peasant societies and rich people. Petty peddlers, that they will sell small things like ropes, bangles. Even today we have people who hawk around on cycles selling bangles and such stuff. Mendicants come merchants, that if they are traveling over a long distance, they will buy something like something with medicinal property or something with say aromatic property. They will go from one place to another and sell it. And entertainers like singers, they perform certain acrobatic activities, such people. So these are small and intermediate traders. And then you have large ones, the guilds and corporate bodies. The guilds have been around since post-Mauryan period. We know about them from their seals, from their donative inscriptions. Sometimes they are mentioned into literature as well. For example, in Arthashastra, even in Arthashastra as well as in Dharmashastras, they say that to regulate any particular economic activity, the king should consult the dominant guild of that sector. So they have been around for a while, and we get evidence of new ones like Mani Gramam, okay, Nanadesi. Now Nanadesi were associated, most likely they were associated with foreign trade, okay, and they were from, these are South Indian guilds. Look, in the case of South India, it is widely accepted that there was no decline in the pace of urbanization, that at once it started, it continued. The word Ayyavol, it means, though some of the examples are not from the book, okay, it literally means the 500. So maybe it was a confederation of 500 traders, something. They originated from the Badami area, and then they gradually expanded over South India and Deccan. Anjuvanam, surprisingly, this was a guild of foreign traders. Guild of foreign traders. And then you have Marwadi, Oswal, Gujarati Baniyas and Bohras and Jains. These community, look, it is very common in India to see that children take the profession of their father, okay. Even now it is very common. So definitely in medieval times, in ancient times, if a community that predominantly practices a certain trade or a certain certain activities like money lending, or if a community is a banker, if a community is a diamond cutter, if a community is a craft person, then their children tend to pick up the same activity. Therefore, an economic activity gets associated with a community, which is rather unique in the case of India. And sometimes, due to that economic activity, they are given a particular position in the caste hierarchy as well. That look, if you are a garland maker, if you are a chariot maker, if you work for leather, or if you work with metal, if you work with diamond, so depending upon the importance of that social activity in society, they are allotted a rank, a jati based rank in social hierarchy as well. So this is something similar, that often a community based trading class emerged. These not only took part in domestic but in international trade as well. As I said, this Anjuvanam was most likely a guild of foreign traders. The Nana Desis took part in international trade as well. In fact, some of their inscriptions are found in faraway Southeast Asia also. Even there, they have made some donations to temples and their name are mentioned in the inscriptions there. The hundi system in 2020, there was a question, what is hundi system? It is a kind of bill of exchange, and in fact the hundis issued by these guilds, they were especially in the modern period, sorry, not modern period but late medieval period, when the trade had become specially globalized due to the 17th century trade revolution. So their hundis were respected as far as Antwerp in Belgium. So this, say, proto banking system helped in trade as well. And then this Lekha Paddhati, there was a question in recent mains examination that evaluate Lekha Paddhati as a source of history. What it is actually, it was written in medieval period, first in Sanskrit and then later in Prakrit, and it is a set of, I would say, standard or framework documents, that how you draw up a certain kind of documents, like a royal decree, a trade agreement, a loan agreement, such things, a land deal. So a set of documents, a set of ideal documents that you can, on the basis of that framework, on the basis of that schematic, you can write your own business contract and stuff. So such things have emerged that tell us that the situation of trade and commerce was very robust. And then you also get the settlements of trading class from other societies, say Arabs, Persians, Chinese, Jewish, Syrian Christians. There were many settlements along the coastline of these communities, along the coastline of India. We have inscriptional evidence to show that Arabs were granted land to build their mosque in Kerala and other places. What they would trade, though they will trade in a variety of items, but these were the most important ones: spices, horses, clothes, precious metal. Now the reason I have highlighted horses is because in medieval India doesn't have natural grasslands. Therefore, it is very difficult to domestically rear horses. India, as long as horses were important, India was the way we are dependent on oil today. Okay, predominantly we import oil. Similarly, India was predominantly dependent on horse imports. Now the horses could be brought from Arabia, horses could be brought from Central Asia. In fact, I'll give you one example. In the conflict between Vijayanagar and Bahmani, both sides tried to keep Portuguese that were running the Goa port in good humor. Both sides wanted to support of Portuguese. Why? Because Portuguese controlled the oceanic trade and they could disrupt or facilitate the supply of horses to Bahmani and Vijayanagar. So the importance of horse was very important. Okay, sorry, I misspoke. The importance of horse was strategically very relevant, because horses, they were you can say they were the tanks of that period. They gave you so much mobility that they were very important for your battle enterprises. So it was a very important item of import. And spices, horses, spices, clothes were other items of export. And at last they have given a box in which they talk about the significance of Kabul. So I think the increased significance of Kabul and Kandahar during this period implies revived trading relationship with Central and West Asia. Because of the because of Delhi Sultanate, the relationship between West Asia and Central Asia had improved. Therefore, the trade with these areas again, because Up to that period, in early medieval period, what we had? We had this constant conflict between the Arabs who had come as far as Sindh, Multan, and on this side we had Rajput states. But when Delhi Sultanate was established, there was no such conflict going on at the frontiers of India. There were conflicts within the frontier. So we saw a rise in trade with Kabul and Kandahar, and via Kabul and Kandahar with Central Asia and West Asia, and therefore during this period the strategic importance of these areas went up as well. Then we talk about craft persons in the town. We talked about towns, we talked about traders that trade, and the trade which facilitates the rise of town. But then we also have to talk about the craft persons that lived in these towns and sometimes gave their, derived their names from these towns. For example, Bidar's craft of inlay work in copper and style gave the name to the trade called Bidri. It has a GI actually. It is even given a geographical indication. What they do, they make an inlay of silver or bronze on metals, utensils, hookah, and such day-to-day use things. So this was one example of the close association of craft persons with towns. Then you have these groups called Panchalas or Vishwakarma's community, consisting of goldsmiths, bronzesmiths, blacksmiths, masons, carpenters, and they were essential to the building of temple. Now, for a moment think, if a community is essential, or their craft or their talent is essential for building temples, what would be their position in social hierarchy? Would they be downtrodden or would they be respected? Now, if you think they will be respected, now what would be their response to the religiosity and piousness? Would they make donations to temples or would they resist the incorporation into such a social structure? So, if your craft is important either for religious activity or for the ruling class, for example, the weapons manufacturers, then certainly you will have a higher position in social hierarchy. Okay, so they also played an important role in the construction of palaces, tanks, and reservoirs. Similarly, weavers such as Saliyars or Kekkolars emerged as prosperous communities making donations to temples. Okay. Apart from these, weapon manufacturers, accountants, fishermen, mariners. Now think about it. On one hand, you have a craft of making weapons, and weapon is not one category. You have sword, you have gunpowder technology, so you have small muskets called, not, let's not use the word musket for it. The earliest guns were arquebus. Then you have these earlier artillery guns which developed varieties later on. So you have these cannonballs, then you have these coins that are sharp nails, such things. So even in weapons manufacturing, you will need a very different kind of specialists. Okay. Then you have accountants, very important to run the state's finances. Fisher folks and mariners, maybe not so important from a state's perspective, but if there is a coastal town and it is dependent on trade, therefore in that area the importance of mariners will be higher. So at last we say that peasantization of tribes, proliferation of crafts, incorporate communities into caste-based societies. What is the meaning of peasantization of tribes? That if a tribe may either a forest dweller or not, earlier they were not exclusively practicing agriculture. Agriculture was subsidiary. They were mainly dependent on hunting, gathering, and such stuff. So in those societies you don't have much wealth. Therefore economic inequality would not be that significant. If economic inequality is not there, you will not have social inequality, and therefore the political institutions will be rather egalitarian. But once a tribal society turns into a peasant society where agriculture is the mainstay, now the differentiation in society starts, because some people will have more land, some people will have less. Some people will have good quality land, some people will have bad quality land, and some will have no land, some will have to depend other craft and etc. So economic inequality leads to social inequality, leads to political inequality, and thus a society which is unequal is divided into caste-based hierarchy. Similarly, proliferation of craft. Now, depending upon the importance of craft, they will be given different positions into the social hierarchy. Okay, they get incorporated into caste-based societies. So see, these things, caste is not completely a rural phenomena. Okay, proliferation of craft leads to urbanization as well. But at the same time, on the basis of the craft you practice, you are turned into a jati, and that jati is put somewhere in the social hierarchy. Okay. Now we are going to look into three examples of Hampi, Masulipatnam and Surat. Now it was the capital of Vijayanagar Empire. Okay. We will study Vijayanagar Empire in more detail in 12th class, medieval. Okay. It is likely that the very choice of the site of Vijayanagar, or rather I should have said Hampi here, not Vijayanagar. Vijayanagar was the empire. Hampi was inspired by the existence of shrines of Virupaksh and Pampa Devi. One important thing about the construction of fortification at Hampi, is that no mortar or cementing agent was used in the construction of fortification walls, and the technique followed was to wedge these stones together by interlocking them. Okay, you interlocked the stones. They did not use mortars, and at time it appeared imposing and robust. But with the advance in gunpowder technology, this was a problem. If you are not using mortar, simply interlocking these stones, then this is a problem when you are being bombarded with the artillery and such modern firearm artillery and such modern firing technologies. So this was, however, one specialty. We will study the urban layout and urbanization features of Hampi in 12th class. This is a very cursory look right now. They also had well-planned orchards and pleasure gardens. Hampi bustled with commercial and cultural activities. Meaning, it was not simply a capital. Okay. It was also not only a temple town. It had all varieties of commercial and cultural activities. Muslim merchants, chettis and agents of chettis are locally significant trading class. And agents of European traders such as Portuguese thronged the markets of Hampi. So it was a proper commercial and economic center as well. This was not something which was dependent on only one sort of activity. It was a proper town in the sense it had multiple layers of fortification. It has different areas. You had royal center, you have sacred center, and then you have places where other sort of activities go on, trade and stuff. Other classes of people live. And between the inner fortification and outer fortification, they even had fields in which they will practice agriculture. Why? Because they have given the answer to this question in 12th class NCERT. I will recommend you to see that they explain that why they had fields between inner and outer fortification. From nearby hills and rivulets, they make arrangements for irrigation and drinking water as well. Drinking water, irrigation, agriculture within the walls of city. They actually made arrangements from the nearby water channels. A true city, not simply a royal cum religious center or a garrison town. Okay, this was a true city. Say, for example, if you look at the cities like, say Tughlaqabad or Siri or Firuzshah Kotla, they are fortifications, and you have open cities around it. Though Delhi was still around, but it was largely, there was no one fortification that covered the entire Delhi. Okay, if there was any fortification, that covered only, say, the garrison town where the Sultan was stationed or his capital was stationed. But Hampi was one such place where a religious center, the royal center, and the living area of commoners, the commercial centers, the cultural centers, even agricultural fields were fortified. So this was a truly mega city in at least medieval sense. And many of the foreigners like Domingo Pace, Duarte Barbosa, Fernão Nunes, Afanasi Nikitin, Niccolo di Conti and Abdul Razak, they visited Vijayanagar's capital, and they have given rich travel travelogues. In fact, if I have to recount, then maybe Vijayanagar Empire would be the only empire in the case of entire Indian history where the account of foreign travelers becomes far more important than perhaps other sources, because they not only studied the cities, what they saw, what they physically saw, they even studied or wrote about the institutions of Vijayanagar Empire, the institutions like Naikar system, the institutions like the kingship, such things. So, and where they were coming from? Nearby port of Goa, Dabhol, such ports which were under the control of Portuguese. And with Portuguese, Vijayanagar Empire had good relations. They supplied horses to them. So a lot of people came from that part and they visited not only cities but countryside as well. Then we look to the gateway to the west, Surat. It was an emporium of Western trade. It sounds like empire, but it's different from empire. What it means, that it is a collection center of sort where goods from different cities were brought, and from here they will be shipped to foreign countries. Similarly, the foreign goods will come here and from here they will go to regional city centers. Okay, so this is called emporium. Here the important trade guilds, important foreign European companies, they will have their own factories where they would not produce anything. See, in modern times when we say factory, we associate it with manufacturing. But in this case, in the case of 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, not 19th, let's say 17, 18. For this period, especially after the arrival of European companies, when we say factory, it means a go down. Okay, where very little, if at all, manufacturing happened. What they did, they collected goods from countryside and from other towns where they would send their commission agents and their brokers to do their deals, and they will bring finished goods there, and from there it will be shipped to foreign countries. So Surat was an emporium of western trade during the Mughal period, also a gateway to Makkah. So a lot of pilgrimage happened from Surat. And the trade with west means the Red Sea area and the Persian Gulf, both places. With both places they will have trading relations. So obviously, even here in last slide we had talked about the, see here we talked about Arab, Persian, Chinese, Jewish and Syrian Christian settlements dotting the coastline. Therefore certainly some of them will be here at Surat, especially the Arabs and Persians. Now a less well known fact is that the Jahanara Begum, the favorite daughter of Shah Jahan, she was given the entire toll custom collection of Surat port as her personal income. Okay, there were certain circumstances in Mughal household in which Shah Jahan was really impressed with his daughter. So he said her, look, the entire revenue, the toll custom collection of the Surat city, the Surat port was allotted to her. It was a cosmopolitan city with many factories. When I say factory here, simply understand go down. Okay, they may belong to they may belong to a European company, a local trade guild, or even some other Arab or Persian traders. Ovington, he was a English trader. In 17th century, he says that he must have written a travelogue where he says that at least 100 ships on average are docked at the port at any given time. So you can say that it was essentially a commercial city. Okay. Now certainly you will have governance infrastructure. Since people live here, so you will have mosque and temple also. But compared to, let's say, Thanjavur, you cannot call it a temple town. Its main activity is commercial. Okay. Similarly, unlike Hampi, you cannot call it a composite city where all sorts of activity go on. It is essentially a port, a commercial center. Textiles of Surat were famous for their gold lace borders called zari. Kathiawadi Seths and Mahajans, Surat Hundis were honored as far as Antwerp. What we said, that their bill of exchange were honored as far as Antwerp. What is a hundi? It simply means that I give you some money and you give me a bill of exchange that this person has deposited this much money with me. So whosoever I take this bill of exchange to, he will give me that money, and take some discount or some charge, some service charge in return. So okay, so this is hundi. What it does, it allows you to travel long distance without carrying the gold or silver with you. Okay. But eventually Surat declined because along with the decline of Mughal and the Mughal trade, and due to the competition from Bombay, which was a presidency town. What happened that in the late 17th century, Surat became a target of frequent Maratha invasions. So this was a disturbance. Also, with the decline of Mughal Empire, it lost a good trade relation, a good market of goods. On the other hand, company moved to Bombay, which was a presidency town. They controlled not only trade but even governance of that. So they felt much more comfortable in conducting their trade via presidency town. So they not only lost their market, they also lost a very important trading, a trading group from that place. So eventually Surat's importance reduced. Nowadays it is known for diamond cutting. Okay. And at last we see the Masulipatam. It was a chief port of the Golconda Sultanate, which lay on the Krishna Delta. It was a major center of foreign trade during 17th century, but geographically ill-suited. One of the foreign traders says that the local sources of water were mostly brackish, so the water was always a problem. Also, it was a shallow port, so not much activity can go on from there. In 1687, Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb annexed Golconda. This was actually because up to the second half of 17th century, the center of gravity of Indian Ocean trade had moved from western coast to eastern coast. This was because of the 17th century trade revolution. What had happened that the European companies, the Dutch East India Company, the East India Company, they preferred to trade from eastern coast rather than western coast. Okay, there were few exceptions, but though I cannot go into the details of what caused this shift, but compared to west coast, the ports of eastern coast were far more important, and the volume of import export trade from east coast was far more than west coast. Therefore the importance of these parts increased, and it is often argued that this was one of the reasons why Aurangzeb decided to annex Golconda, so that they could capture this trade. As the company traders moved to Bombay, Calcutta and Madras, all three presidency towns, Masulipatam lost both its merchants and prosperity and declined in the course of 18th century. Okay. A new policy of East India Company was that it was not enough if a port had connections with the production centers of the hinterland. The new company trade centers, it was felt, should combine political, administrative and commercial roles. See, if you are trading via a port of some other state, then you have to pay duties. Now this was the era of mercantilism, where the European companies wanted to monopolize more and more trade and pay less and less tax. They thought that was the only way they can increase their profit. So they wanted to have their own ports where they would not pay any taxes. They will improve or invest in infrastructure as they want, and then if once their port becomes attractive, other companies and local states will use those ports for trading activity. Also, if they own the entire port, the governance, rules and regulations, everything will be their own. Okay, it would also be a safe bastion from plunder and attacks from competing kings. Say Surat was attacked once or twice. Similarly, in 1740s and between 1740s and 50s, there was repeated Maratha attacks on say Bengal area. So this was also a problem. But European companies thought, okay, we will fortify our presidency towns, and whenever there is an attack, we will hide behind the walls. Since we are not challenging anyone, we will not be challenged. And if we have fortified our presidency towns, we can defend it as well. We have modern our technology of light infantry, light gun, and rank and file fire. Such technologies we have. So they thought that if we have our own towns, it will be economically profitable, politically more suitable, and even administratively more convenient. Therefore, they started to move away from the extant cities, and they started to invest more in their own presidency towns. New towns and urban centers happened due to the 7th century trade revolution led by European companies. Though as this will go outside the scope of this book, I cannot go into the detail of trade revolution, but understand simply this: it meant that European companies created a market for Indian goods, especially goods like textile and spices, indigo, saltpeter and such things, not only in neighboring regions, say Africa or West Asia. They created a global market for Indian goods. They will buy from India, they will sell in Southeast Asia, in Japan, South Korea, China, not I should not say South Korea right now, say Korean Peninsula, Japan, China, the not only not only east coast of Africa, but west coast of Africa, across Atlantic, both New North and South America and Europe. For example, Dutch East India Company, what they used to do, they will purchase textile from Coromandel coast, they will sell that textile to Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, purchase spices, and then take those spices to Europe. Okay, so this was the trade revolution, that creating a global market of Indian goods, and it had certain other impacts. One such impact was on the nature of urbanization. What happened? It started out with factories in established cities like Surat, Masulipatam, etc., but eventually moved into their own presidency towns. They thought this was good for their business and good for their political power as well. Crafts and commerce underwent major changes as merchants and artisans were moved into black towns established by European companies within these cities. So these cities were divided into two parts: black towns and white towns. Local craft persons and commerce traders were moved into black towns where natives lived, and the blacks or natives, traders and top persons were confined here, while white rulers occupied the superior residences in Fort St. George in Madras, or Fort St. William in Calcutta, or Fort St. David near Puducherry. So they took a very large part of trade inside presidency towns. For example, the handicraftsmen who churned out a very fine quality cotton or silk goods, they and it would be wrong to suggest that they forced people to live in presidency towns. For some reasons, it was often the case that it was more secure to live inside these presidency towns. So often craft persons moved out of countryside and started living in these towns. There they will be given advances and they will be told that you have to make clothes on a certain pattern with certain designs, that they will make it and they will be paid the rest of the money. So what happened, that craftsmen and traders, okay, and these presidency towns turned into a local ecosystem with its own sense of commerce, with its own attitude of commerce, and it had relations with in export sector as well as it had connections in hinterland, because after all, to make finished goods you need raw material, and to fetch raw materials you have to have connections with the neighboring states and hinterland of villages. These presidency towns had an intense focus on commerce, means not temple or mosque type activity. They could have temples and mosques because after all people are living and they need places to of worship, okay, but the purpose of these towns was one and one only: commerce. Therefore even their administration or local municipal governance looked more like the municipal governance that we see today. Okay, they would not have zamindars or asserting their control over towns. They would not have temples having some governance roles. They would not have samant or zamindar interfering or imposing caste rules or imposing religious dogmas. They were very I would say gradually these towns expanded, and especially their municipal governance. I mean, the earliest example of municipal governance in India comes from the presidency town of Chennai, the Madras, I would say. So they, I mean, at least in the sense of governance, they look far more like modern towns. Okay, the rest of the story of craft persons and the artisans of the, especially in the 18th century, will be covered in next class. Just wanted to mention this thing called dastak. If you recall, the East India Company had taken a dastak, means you can say a concession from earlier from Mughal emperors, and this became a bone of contention between Bengal governor and company. Why? Because it was given only for it was special, basically for duty-free export trade via their own presidency towns. So what happened that they wanted, they still had to collect raw material from countryside. Then they will get finished goods from artisans either living in presidency towns or living in their own villages, and then that will be exported. The dastak was only applicable to that extent, but it was widely misused, and that became a bone of contention that led to Battle of Plassey and etc. So in a way that began the modern age of India. Again, the modern age is not progress, not a progress. Modern in the case of India means most recent. Okay. So with this we are wrapping up the chapter 6. The next chapters we will see in next lectures. Thank you.